Imagine a 20-lane superhighway, right? Carrying the absolute lifeblood of the global economy, and then suddenly it's squeezed into a single, heavily mined dirt path.
Yeah, that is essentially what we are looking at right now.
Tanker traffic has plummeted by, what, 70%? Brent crude is spiking. Welcome to April 1st, 2026, where the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and paradoxically, Canada is holding all the cards.
Which is just a wild situation to be in.
It really is. We are looking at a highly detailed new research paper today. It's titled The Global Review by Dr. Fareed Novin. And our mission today is to decode the single largest disruption to global oil supply in recorded history.
Right, but we aren't just looking at the conflict itself, are we?
No, not at all. We are exploring it's a mind-bending, three-dimensional geopolitical chess game that's playing out as a direct result.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we're looking at a web that connects international military strikes, continental trade wars, and a literal secession crisis happening right now in Alberta. Yeah, we are essentially watching a nested game play out in real time. The source material makes it clear that a single diplomatic signal sent from Ottawa right now, it echoes simultaneously in Washington, in the Middle East, and in Calgary.
It's all connected.
Exactly. Every move is calculated, and the stakes for the global economy, and honestly, the actual fabric of the Canadian Federation, they are incredibly high.
So let's start by looking at the shockwaves that set this entire board in motion. On February 28th of this year, the U.S. and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury.
Right, the coordinated airstrikes on Iranian military infrastructure.
Exactly. And in retaliation, just a few days later on March 4th, Iran effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping.
Which is, you can't overstate how huge that is.
Right. As you likely know, the Strait handles 20% of the world's seaborne oil and a fifth of internationally traded LNG.
Yeah, liquefied natural gas.
Right. But seeing that physical squeeze instantly drop tanker traffic by 70%, it just shows the sheer fragility of the whole system. Brent crude was sitting in the low $60 range last year.
And then it just shot up.
Spiked to $126 a barrel. It's hovering around $114 right now. But analysts are warning of a worst-case $200 a barrel if this drags on.
Which would be catastrophic.
And the Dallas Fed is projecting that a closure lasting 2 to 3 quarters could wipe out zero point 0.3 to 1.3 percentage points of global GDP.
Wow.
Yeah. When I look at those numbers, it seems the market isn't just pricing in the missing barrels. It's pricing in the sheer panic of an indefinite logistical nightmare.
What's fascinating here is the absolute asymmetry of that panic. Because, the pain of this disruption is not distributed equally across the globe at all.
Right. It hits different countries differently.
Exactly. Nations like China, India, Japan, and South Korea, they are intensely exposed because of their massive reliance on Gulf crude. Their economies take an immediate, visceral hit.
Right. They need that energy to function.
But this localized choke point creates a bizarre structural paradox for major net exporting nations that sit entirely outside the Gulf.
Because their supply routes aren't affected.
Exactly. When supply drops this drastically, the global benchmark skyrockets. So if you produce more oil than you consume and your export routes completely bypass that 34-kilometer stretch of water, well, a global economic catastrophe suddenly transforms into a massive, unprecedented fiscal windfall.
Which forces us to look directly at Canada, because they are currently living out this wild double-edged sword scenario. On the macro level, Canada is getting incredibly rich off this.
Oh, absolutely, plumbing in cash.
Yeah. Western Canadian Select, which is the benchmark for Alberta heavy oil, it shot up by $35, hitting around $85 a barrel. Alberta's GDP forecasts have been completely rewritten upward.
In the middle of a global crisis, no less.
Right. But if you look at the micro level, the Canadian consumer, just driving to work, they're being brutally squeezed.
Because of the refined products?
Exactly. Refined products like gasoline are priced on global benchmarks. So gas prices in Canada jumped from $1.30 to $1.55 per liter in a matter of weeks.
That's a massive jump for the average person.
And it entirely wiped out the savings consumers just got from the federal carbon levy being eliminated.
Right. People were expecting relief, and instead they got a massive price hike.
And this happens because Canada still imports roughly 30% of its refined products from the U.S. So Ottawa and the producing provinces are swimming in cash, while the everyday citizen is subsidizing that windfall at the pump.
It is a profound domestic cost asymmetry, and it's driven entirely by the mechanical realities of how energy is refined and traded. But the real crux of Canada's geopolitical position right now, it lies in its physical infrastructure.
Right. Let's talk about the pipelines.
Look at the newly expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline, TMX. It tripled its capacity to 890,000 barrels a day back in May of 2024.
Giving them that direct line to the Pacific?
Exactly. Combine that with the LNG Canada facility in Kitimat, and Canada suddenly possesses the physical capability to sell heavy crude and natural gas directly to Asia, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, and the South China Sea.
So they have a completely safe route.
Right. In a global market that is absolutely desperate for secure, non-conflict zone energy, Canada is suddenly holding a golden ticket.
But wait, I look at those
Eh,
infrastructure numbers and I see a massive limitation.
Oh, there definitely is one.
Yeah, the paper points out that while we have this massive pipeline hose to the Pacific, the actual spare capacity on TMX right now is only about 100,000 barrels a day.
Which is not a lot in the grand scheme of things.
No, it's roughly a 10% bump. In a global market missing millions of barrels a day, that feels like showing up to a forest fire with a garden hose.
Our garden hose.
Like if it will put
Yeah.
the fire out, but if you're the only one offering water, I suppose you still get to dictate the terms.
That garden hose analogy captures the leverage perfectly, actually. The strategic value here isn't about replacing the missing Middle Eastern volume barrel for barrel tomorrow morning. Canada can't do that.
Right, the math just doesn't work.
No. The leverage comes from long-term security. Even that marginal 100,000 barrels of short-term capacity is incredibly valuable right now for desperate buyers.
Because it's a guaranteed supply.
Exactly. But more importantly, it allows Canada to credibly lock in long-term contracts with Japan, South Korea, India, and China.
Oh, wow. So they're playing the long game.
Absolutely. By positioning itself as a stable, non-Hormuz-dependent supplier during a period of acute historic vulnerability, Canada secures geopolitical and commercial dividends that will outlast this immediate crisis by decades.
That's huge.
It is. That newfound weight fundamentally alters Ottawa's diplomatic posture on the world stage.
And that altered posture is colliding immediately with Washington. Because this crisis arrived at the exact moment, Canada is locked in a high-stakes renegotiation of its entire economic relationship with the United States.
The timing is just incredible.
It's wild. The USMCA is undergoing its first mandatory 6-year joint review right now. And there is a hard deadline of July 1st, 2026.
Which is fast approaching.
Very fast. You have the Trump administration and USTR Ambassador Greer demanding major concessions. On the other side, Prime Minister Mark Carney, who won the 2025 election, specifically promising to resist U.S. economic coercion, he wants his own wins.
Right. On dairy, digital services taxes, and auto supply chains.
Exactly. The paper dives into how Canada is weaponizing its energy position using Bayesian game theoretic analysis. And from what I understand of Bayesian theory, it's not just about keeping your opponent guessing.
No, it's much more mathematical than that.
Right, it's about forcing them to constantly update their mathematical probability of what your true motives are based on your actions.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the trade negotiations, the Bayesian mechanics are brilliant. In a Bayesian game, players operate with incomplete information about the other player's type or, their true threshold for pain.
So Washington doesn't really know what Ottawa's thinking.
Exactly. The U.S. doesn't know with absolute certainty if Canada is delaying its military assistance in the Gulf strictly to extort trade concessions, or if Ottawa genuinely requires a ceasefire for domestic, political, or humanitarian reasons.
Okay, that makes sense.
The paper outlines 3 scenarios. If Canada chooses scenario 1 and immediately rushes in with unconditional military aid to reopen the Strait, they confirm to the U.S. that they are a compliant ally.
But they lose their leverage.
They give up all their leverage. The U.S. takes the help and offers 0 concessions in the USMCA talks.
What about the other extreme?
Right. Scenario 3. If Canada completely refuses to help under any circumstances, the U.S. updates its Bayesian probability to view Canada as a hostile actor.
Which would trigger devastating retaliatory tariffs, I imagine.
Exactly. It would be a trade war.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Canada goes with scenario 2, conditional engagement. Defense Minister McGuinty and Foreign Affairs Minister Anand publicly offer naval vessels, demining experts, and cyber support. But they make it strictly conditional on a ceasefire being reached first.
It's a very calculated middle ground.
Yeah. To build on the earlier analogy, it's like standing next to the hydrant while your neighbor's house is on fire. You're holding the wrench. and strongly implying you'll only turn the water on after they agree to fix the property line fence you've been arguing about for years.
That is exactly what they are doing, and by standing by that hydrant, choosing conditional engagement, Canada forces the U.S. into a corner.
Because they can't get mad at Canada for refusing to help, since Canada technically offered.
Precisely. Ottawa signals a willingness to cooperate, preserving the alliance, but makes it painfully clear that cooperation isn't free. Crucially, the mechanics of this delay ensure that global oil prices remain sky high.
And that hurts the U.S.
It hurts them a lot. Sustaining that high oil price maximizes Canada's leverage over a U.S. administration that is currently battling spiking inflation, furious voters paying more for gas, and severe supply chain anxieties.
So they're just letting Washington sweat.
Essentially, yes. The longer the price remains elevated, the more desperate the U.S. becomes for North American energy integration. And the more likely Washington is to concede on those crucial dairy and auto rules just to stabilize the continent.
But deliberately leveraging the U.S. by keeping global oil prices high creates a fatal domestic side effect. Ottawa's strategy of delay is actively pouring gasoline on a ticking time bomb inside Canada's own borders.
The secession crisis.
Yes. We have to look at how this impacts Alberta. It feels like an inverted resource curse. Usually, a massive influx of oil wealth centralizes power in a petrostate.
Right, the central government gets stronger.
But here, the wealth is giving a province the actual means to fracture the country.
The nested game becomes incredibly dangerous at the domestic level here. Ottawa cannot execute this international Bayesian strategy without triggering severe domestic consequences.
Because Alberta is getting so rich.
Exactly. The same high oil prices squeezing Washington are simultaneously supercharging Alberta's economy and emboldening its political fringes.
Right now, there is a live citizen petition led by the Alberta Prosperity Project. They need 177,732 valid signatures by May 2nd, 2026.
Which is coming up very soon.
Very soon. And if they hit that mathematical threshold, it legally forces a provincial referendum on secession in October of 2026.
A legally binding referendum.
Yeah. And Premier Danielle Smith has publicly committed to respecting that democratic process if the signatures are validated.
The grievances here aren't new, though.
No, they are rooted in long-standing anger over Federal Bill C-69, mandated emissions caps, and coastal tanker bans. But when I look at this domestic trap, it seems impossible.
It's a catch-22 for Ottawa.
Literally. If Ottawa helps open the Strait quickly, the price of oil crashes. Alberta loses its historic fiscal windfall and absolutely revolts, accusing Ottawa of prioritizing global alliances over Western Canadian prosperity.
They'd be furious.
But if Ottawa sustains the delay, the price stays high, and Alberta gets so incredibly rich that the provincial government suddenly has the actual fiscal resources to fund a highly credible, economically viable separation campaign.
It gives them the war chest they need.
Exactly. Unless Ottawa is somehow masking its motives, how do they survive either outcome?
Well, they survive by employing a very deliberate masking strategy. The federal government is attempting to hide its domestic maneuver behind an international principle justification.
Wait, how so?
Well, Prime Minister Carney actually signed a memorandum of understanding with Alberta back in November 2025 to facilitate new pipelines. That was an early attempt to cool secessionist temperatures.
Oh, right, but that made other provinces mad.
Exactly. It instantly angered British Columbia and Quebec.
No.
So now Ottawa is framing its delay in the Middle East strictly as a principled stand for protecting global supply chains and insisting on a humanitarian ceasefire.
Ah, so they're playing the good guy on the world stage.
Right. They cannot publicly admit they are using the crisis to squeeze the Americans or to placate Calgary. By holding the price high through conditional engagement, Ottawa quietly demonstrates to Alberta that remaining in the Federation is highly profitable right now.
Like, look how much money you're making staying with us.
Exactly. The influx of cash is designed to pacify moderate voters and the business community. It makes the secession petition look like an unnecessary, chaotic economic risk during a boom time.
But using a global crisis as a mechanical tool for domestic leverage and trade negotiations has a very real human cost. The paper dives into the stark realities on the ground.
And it is grim.
It really is.
Yeah.
The Strait closure is causing a severe humanitarian emergency right now. Gulf states rely on that specific waterway for 80% of their caloric intake.
80% of their food.
Yes. And the Iranian strikes hit vital desalination infrastructure in Qatar and Kuwait, directly threatening the drinking water supply for millions.
It's an absolute disaster.
Furthermore, because of the logistical breakdown, the global price of urea, which is a critical fertilizer, is up 20%.
And we are right at the start of the spring planting season.
Exactly. That threatens global food production yields exactly as we enter the spring 2026 planting season. So what does this all mean for the people actually suffering right now? While Ottawa is patting itself on the back for playing brilliant game theory, aren't they effectively profiting from a disaster where people are losing access to drinking water?
This raises an important question about the underlying philosophies driving state behavior. The research paper examines this through the contrasting lenses of liberal institutionalism and realism.
Okay, break that down for me.
Liberal institutionalism argues that Canada, historically a middle power, has a primary obligation to the rules-based international order. Under this framework, Ottawa should prioritize human rights, maritime law, and the immediate alleviation of suffering.
So they should rush aid to the Gulf no matter what.
Exactly, regardless of the lost trade leverage or domestic fallout. But realism dictates the exact opposite.
Realism is more about self-interest, right?
Right. It views the international system as fundamentally anarchic. A state's only true duty is its own survival and prosperity. From a strictly realist perspective, Canada is acting entirely rationally by exploiting this structural leverage to secure its economic future and prevent its own country from fracturing.
When you look at the actual outcomes, though, the mechanics of their strategy mean they are effectively benefiting from the chaos. Does the paper suggest Canada's diplomatic posture effectively washes its hands of that reality?
The paper is highly analytical about this tension. It observes that Canada is attempting to maintain a normative defense by officially supporting G7 joint statements condemning the attacks.
So they are doing the diplomatic paperwork.
Right, they're maintaining a diplomatic stabilizer posture. Because they are conditioning their help on a ceasefire rather than actively blocking the Strait from opening, they can argue they are pushing for peace.
But that's just optics, isn't it?
Pretty much. The uncomfortable mechanical truth of strategic delay is that as the clock runs, the chaos continues. And as the chaos continues, Canada's bank accounts grow, and its trade leverage over the U.S. increases.
It's a dark reality.
It perfectly illustrates where liberal ideals and ruthless geopolitical self-interest intersect in the modern era.
It really does. Today's deep dive showed us how a single localized disruption, the closure of a 34-kilometer stretch of water, ignited an incredibly complex chain reaction.
A reaction that touches almost every part of the globe.
Yeah. We examined the asymmetry of the global shock and how Canada transformed a massive supply crisis into unprecedented leverage for the July 2026 USMCA review through Bayesian game theory.
Which was fascinating to unpack.
It was. And we looked at how Ottawa is desperately using that exact same strategy to keep Alberta from separating, all while navigating the profound tension between being a global peacekeeper and a rational, self-interested actor.
The true takeaway here is the absolute interconnectedness of the system. A drone strike in the Gulf mechanically alters a trade tariff in Washington.
Which is wild to think about.
Right. And then that tariff influence, in turn, impacts a signature on a secession petition in Calgary. In the modern era, no crisis can be isolated. Every action echoes across multiple dimensions.
Absolutely. And I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder as you digest all of this.
Oh, I'm curious.
Well, even if a ceasefire is signed tomorrow and the Strait of Hormuz reopens and oil plummets back down to $60 a barrel, you have to wonder, has this specific crisis permanently altered Canada's DNA?
That is a great question.
Right. If a nation discovers exactly how much raw power it wields when it acts purely as a rational, calculating energy superpower, can it ever truly go back to being just a polite, rule-following middle power?
It's hard to put the genie back in the bottle.
Exactly. It's a question that will likely define the geopolitical landscape for the rest of the decade. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.